What's going on, guys? Scar coming at you with another Magic the Gathering video. In today's video, we are going to be diving into some decks that I found a website that I saw through watching other Magic the Gathering streamers videos where they kind of post these deck lists where they post mythic to platinum ranked players decks that have won 6 games in a row, and they show off the deck list in the traditional sense of best of 3. And I figured I'd show you a couple of those decks out on this website. We are going to dive into what that website is, so if you guys want to check this out yourself, it does update. It seems like every few days, sometimes it's like every day. I'm not really sure 100% on how it exactly works. The key thing is that these decks have won 6 in a row, so that is the one key indicator. These are also traditional best of 3 decks, so they do all include sideboards. But I'm sure with some tweaking based on how the meta is playing out for you when you're playing these decks, you can definitely tweak the deck itself to kind of figure out what cards work best from the sideboard into the main deck if you seem like you're going against certain matchups overall. Since the cards do have sideboards, it kind of helps in that sense of the deck. So I'm sure some of these decks would probably be tuned for a best of 1 matchup. Don't know if you're gonna have the same success of winning 6 in a row, but I'm sure you can definitely squeak out 4 or 5 wins in a row if possible, especially if you tweak it the right way and get the right favorable matchups for the deck you are playing. With that being said, guys, if you like the video, hit that like button. It definitely helps out the channel out a lot. If you're new to the channel and want to know when I post more videos, hit that subscribe button. We are kind of approaching 1,000 subscribers. I think at the time of recording this video, we're a shade underneath 900. I'm hoping to hit 1,000 maybe by the end of the year. I mean, I know it's kind of a lofty goal, but who knows what could happen. Enough said, let's dive into the website and then dive into some decks and kind of break down each one. All right, so this is the website. It's actually, I believe, an official Magic the Gathering website. It's called magic.gg's. Essentially what this is the current date of October 27th of the time of recording. Actually, it's the day before because we just transitioned as I'm recording this slightly over midnight as I'm kind of putting out this video. This is the prior day's deck list that have being published, and what this is a website that will post these deck lists that have won 6 in a row, and these players are platinum or mythic or higher, essentially. So that means that they're pretty high up there. They do play a lot of Magic, so these decks have been played through, and these decks just won 6 in a row, so they get posted. And essentially this, as I guess these decks pop up, they'll just kind of have these lists on the website here that you kind of see the various decks. These are all best of 3 standard decks, like I said, and then you can kind of look at the sideboard, and you can always tweak the decks to maybe run some of these cards that are in these sideboards into the main deck if you feel like some of these cards are good against some of the matchups that are in best of 1. Now, all these decks are pretty solid, but all around. I haven't really played a bunch of these decks, but you can kind of see the certain matchups based on what you're looking at in these deck lists. I mean, there's a common ground of a lot of these decks. I mean, granted, there isn't, the great thing is there's a great variety. I think that's one thing they do very, very strongly. We don't know the players who play these decks, so that's the other thing too. So if you see your deck, let me know. But I mean, this does give you a good indicator what people are playing in, the higher rankings of Magic the Gathering Arena. If you are new to the game, don't really understand what the high meta decks are. And like I said, it gives you a good variety of things that maybe aren't part of the current meta. These are some more off, some more of these more off the main meta style side, which could give you a good refresher if you're looking for something new to play. With that being said, let's kind of bump into some of the decks. Let's talk about some of the ones that I pulled actually off the traditional standard deck list for the 27th October, and kind of go over each one and what each one uniquely brings to the table. All right, so this first list is actually a list I feel like I haven't seen. It's like a trip down memory lane. I remember when Ikoria first came out, and the Gyruda decks or the broken deck overall. I don't know how good a Gyruda deck is, but the fact to see a Gyruda deck do well in a best of 3 style meta, it seems pretty promising. I mean, I don't know really what else to say. I mean, this one is a very interesting deck on what it's trying to do. The whole thing with Gyruda is that it comes into battlefield, you reveal top 4. Each player puts the top 4 cards of their library into their graveyard. You get to play even creature amongst them onto the battlefield. So essentially what we're trying to do here is just trying to play a bunch of, trying to play a Gyruda out, whether from our commander zone and or from the deck itself, because we do play 3 additional copies. Do the mill effect into the graveyard, get a creature that's an even cost of those 4 cards, whether it's from our graveyard, our deck or our opponent's deck, and we get to put it on the battlefield underneath our control. And essentially, it's not as broken because, we don't have a few things to make copies of Gyruda to, make it almost endless. But, we could still get a Thassa, which could essentially, flicker in a Gyruda out, in and out again, allowing us to do the ability once again to mill the top cards of our library, get something out of the thing, and essentially do the same, do it all over again. And now looking at the deck overall, I mean, it is pretty interesting what it's trying to do. It does play, it does play higher end cards overall. I mean, nothing too crazy. Essentially, it is a Gyruda, and we also are running a Mori as a 1 copy of in the deck. I guess if we get it out or before Gyruda, it makes our Gyruda overall cost 1 less, which is good. So we can play for 5. It makes all our creatures then cost 1 less as well. And there's a couple interesting things in here. We got the Kogla, we got the Massacre Worms. I guess these are for the matchups against like rogues. Kogla is good against anything that you want it to fight. It's essentially a good spell if we have any humans in the deck, which I don't know off the top of my bat. Is that a human? Yeah, it is human rogue. We can actually bounce a human back, give it indestructible end of turn, which is also fairly strong. A few cool cards in that sense. You got a couple of the legendary enchantment cards. I don't know if we're gonna get the devotion up because it looks like we have very diverse devotion of what we really have in the deck. But overall, I mean, it's a pretty interesting deck. I mean, it looks like we're utilizing Lotus Cobra to maybe ramp up and play Gyruda a little bit earlier. We got some things that produce mana, Wolfwall of Heavens, Scavengers to eat our opponent's graveyard, I guess, to eat whatever they put in the graveyard. Acquisition Expert is also a pretty solid card in here. We're not really trying to go for the party aspect, but making our opponent discard a card for 2 mana seems pretty sweet in general. A little bit of removal. But like I said, overall, it's pretty interesting in what we kind of got going on here. I mean, I'm actually kind of excited to probably run this and, give you guys a video of what exactly this deck is trying to do. If you guys decide to run it, I mean, the links for all these decks will be down in the description down below. If you guys want to copy them over to Arena, play them out, let me know how you do, which one's your favorite. If you do copy all of them, that'd be definitely awesome to hear what you guys decide to pick out your favorite out of all these. But, it's pretty interesting to see a Gyruda deck be pretty successful. Now, this next deck up that you kind of see here, this could be a deck list that you may have already seen. I believe I saw CGB run this deck overall already in one of his videos. I guess it popped up again on this website yet again for the overall the overall magic.gg's. So I guess this deck is pretty solid in the sense that it is popping up, that it's winning, to pop up on the website. I guess someone else has to play it, or maybe the same creator actually played it again that created the deck. But it's actually a pretty interesting deck, and what this deck is essentially, it's like one of those aura style decks where you're trying to play a creature, put some auras on it, make it really big, swing it to your opponent, and deal a lot of damage. And essentially, it's running a few cool cards in the deck to overall make it much better. You got this Attestant Champion to kind of attach whenever we play an enchantment spell, it gets a +1/+1 counter, allows us to dig it deeper into our deck, essentially, which is very good because that turns off Heartless Act against it, in the sense of Heartless Act actually killing it, which is pretty good. We also are running Storm Heralds. When it enters the battlefield, return any number of aura cards from our graveyard to the battlefield attached to creatures you control at the beginning of exile those auras at the beginning of your next end step. If those auras would leave the battlefield, exile them instead of put them in the graveyard instead. So essentially, if you get a lot of auras that maybe your opponent milled into your deck if you're playing against rogues, this is actually a good card because it's now going to take those auras out of your graveyard. You can then attach it to something like your Storm Herald or something like your Attestant Champion, Mire Triton, even Owl Seeds of Life Bounty, Hateful Eidolon, which is another card. And essentially what this is going to do is allow you to recur things from your graveyard and essentially put them on the battlefield and get some big quick damage in. So it's kind of like that bursty style effect. But overall, I mean, that's a pretty solid idea what you could do. We could call the Death Dweller to get anything back from the graveyard that our opponent may have removed from the graveyard, because we don't play a lot of threats. I mean, I think there is a total of, it looks like a total of like 15-16 threats. I can click on the actual number on the thing after this. We play a bunch of auras. We play Agadeem's Awakening, which is a good way to get back cards with a converted mana cost X or less, so we can essentially tap this for 6 and get back everything that's 3, 2, and 1. I think CGB did point out in his video when he was talking about this does have a very heavy 3-drop area, essentially. I mean, sure, the Agadeem doesn't really count because you're not going to play for 0, you're going to more than likely play for higher, but there's a lot of 3-drops in the deck, so the early game, it could get very clunky, be kind of slow. But if you do get the right cards, you definitely can put your opponent in a position that it does definitely make it very awkward for them. We also do run this Attestant Training, which is not a lot of copies of, but it does give our creature trample that we do put it on, so essentially makes anything that we put all that glitters on essentially that much stronger, because now it can trample through for damage. Put out one of our guys that gain life, whether it's All Seeds or Hateful Eidolon, essentially now we're going to gain life and trample through for damage, which is very good. I think the mana could also be an issue just because it looks a little clunky. It looks, I mean, granted, there's a lot of pathways, there's no basics, so that spell that costs 1 less, if your opponent's playing no basics or has no basics on the battlefield, could be kind of troublesome for this deck, just because it's something that's gonna hit us. you know, for cheaper, essentially because of the land base. But overall, this does seem like a fun deck, and what the deck has in the sideboard is pretty good. You know, it's got Fido's 1 for some protection, whether it's gives our humans or non-human creatures indestructible. And I'm sure there's a couple cards in here that you could probably you know, add into the deck, you know, if you want to throw some Myers Grasps in. I mean, there's not really much to reoccur things from our graveyard, but I mean, overall, it's a pretty cool deck. I mean, I don't know if you throw a Luris in here, but yet again, that's another 3-drop, which then creates interesting things. But Luris could be a possibility just because it's one of those things we get auras back by playing them for the Luris cost. Instead of playing them again, give back our smaller drops all over again if they do get removed to the graveyard. Let me know what you guys think about this deck. I think it's an interesting deck. It's definitely pretty cool on what it's trying to do. But let's move on to the next deck and break that one down. So I saw this deck, and because I just this list is getting recorded after I already done an Azorius Flyer style deck, which wasn't too successful, but to see like an Azorius style deck be pretty successful, I'm calling this Azorius Tempo because the deck lists don't have any names, so I gave this one a name. But it's kind of interesting what it's trying to do. It's like a Azorius life gain tempo-y style deck. It plays a lot of good cards in it, what it's trying to do. You know, it's got a lot of, you know, decent 1-drops. It's got the Ginger Brute for some easy damage, give it unblockable unless the creature control hit haste. We can sacrifice to gain some life. Stern Dismissal for some bounce back. Speaker of the Heavens if we can kind of gain some life, you know, get to 27, start creating angel tokens. Light of Hope as a gain 4 life, destroy target enchantment, or put a +1/+1 counter on target creature, which all can be very, very good. It looks like we got Charmer Prince to flicker some things in and out, scry some cards, gain some life, which is very, very solid as well. Griffin Ares, kind of like another thing to be a creature producer or token producer, so we can essentially start creating Griffin tokens onto the battlefield, which will be very, very good because there are many ways for us to gain that 3 life very, very easily. Revitalize for the card draw, Sergi's Shelter for the protection, or also the tap land just in case we need some lands on the battlefield. Skyclave Cleric just because the same thing, gain some life, play it as a tap land if, you know, that is an option if you're kind of low on white mana. We got Essence Scatter for that spot creature removal, Lofty Denial because there's some things in the deck that do have you know, that do have flying, especially once we start getting the Griffins out. We'll definitely have cards that will you know, you make this cost more for our opponent to play spells, which is very, very good, but let alone a 2-mana counter that counters anything, even if our opponent has to pay 1 in the early game, could be pretty disruptive. Naya Ramp, which is pretty interesting here, allows us to return target creature we control to our hand. If we do gain life, that creature's convert mana cost. So essentially we can bounce something back if our opponent's trying to target it at flash speed, or we can tap 3 mana if we have another one of these in our hand, or another legendary thing, which I think there's only this in the deck actually looking at it. You know, we can bounce another, you can essentially discard one of these and, you know, draw another card, but it looks like we're only playing 1 copy. We got Staggering Insight for the card draw and also the lifelink. We can throw this on like a Ginger Brute or one of our Griffins, and essentially giving that Griffin now the ability to have +3/+3 and lifelink. It'll essentially make it the 1 Griffin making more Griffins, which is very, very good. Maze Mind Tome, because I think since, you know, the adventure style decks have gone out of style and Brazen Barber is not as potent as it used to be in like a more effective way, Maze Mind Tome has kind of become a little bit stronger. And, you know, the ability to scry the top card, tap 2 and just draw a card, and essentially once this gets 4 counters, we gain 4 life, which essentially triggers Griffin Aerie yet again, which is definitely good. Splendor Mare is an interesting card here because essentially, yes, it's a 3/3 for 3 mana that has lifelink, but essentially the cycling at like instant speed that can't be countered and putting a lifelink counter on target creature we control is pretty interesting. That's something that's going to definitely catch an opponent off guard if not ready for it. This Celindi's Vision is another good card. It allows us to look at top 6 of our library, reveal instants or sorcery, which our deck is full of them. We get to put one of those into our hand, put the rest in the bottom of our library in any order, and yet again this can become a blue land in case we need blue mana. And of course Brazen Borrower as the bounce card and also the 3/1 flyer, but can't block anything that's without flying. And then the mana base is pretty straightforward, a lot of, you know, basics, and then 1 scry, and then things that gain life. And then the sideboard, depending on what you think you're playing against, you can always, you know, put things in the deck if you think any of these counters, it looks like, are going to help disrupt whatever your opponent's trying to do. If you feel like you're playing a lot against rogues or something, and maybe you're not getting enough of the Griffin Aries out to gain the life, you can always swap the Lofty Denials for Mystical Disputes, you know, things like that. You know, possibly drop negates if you're not playing like decks of creatures, or get rid of Essence Scatter, play more negates, things like that. Essentially, you know, you can always tweak this deck to kind of make it the way you want to based on how your opponents are playing. Like I said, I actually kind of like the list the way it is. I think it's just going to require some playthrough and kind of figure out whether it's good or not, and essentially where it needs to improve upon. I feel like the one problem with this is that it's relying a lot on life gain, and if certain cards don't come out, I feel like it plays a little bit slow, but overall it could be a fun deck to play, especially against the more aggressive style decks. So this is the Boros deck. It actually is kind of intriguing because, you know, this is actually a different one. This is focusing on warriors, so it's like a Boros Warriors style deck with equipments and things like that. You know, most of them are playing Winota is the main card that, you know, most of these decks are playing. They're playing a lot of dogs that are, you know, much cheaper creatures, ways to get cheaper creatures in the battlefield. But this one looks like it's trying to be like a Boros Warrior style deck with equipments, which is definitely cool in my opinion, just because I feel like we don't see enough of that. Essentially, you know, the deck is pretty interesting, like on what it's trying to do. Actually, looking at the mana base, there's actually not a lot of lands in the deck. A lot of it's also from the the modal style lands, the flip lands. It looks like, you know, you got Amira's Call in the late game if we want to play it for the actual card, but we also play that as a modal land. It looks like it's got the Skull Shatter and Smash in. We also have, you know, the Shirji Shelter, the Takedown, you know, Spikefield Hazard. It looks like it's playing a lot more into the modal lands, which I feel like could also be possibly slow. So it's always like, if you feel like that's the thing, it looks like it's trying to play more threats and more things to put on the battlefield than to play lands, which is kind of an interesting strategy. I feel like we don't see a lot of this. I feel like this one's definitely heavily into that, but it's kind of cool what it's trying to do in that sense. You know, it is warriors, it is equipments. You know, it's playing some cards that I feel like you just don't see, like the Akiri. You know, Nahiri is kind of cool to see. You know, everyone saw Nahiri come out and thought Nahiri was going to be like a great planeswalker. This could be the deck that actually shines and makes Nahiri much better. I think, you know, as we get more equipments, you know, it's definitely going to be one of those cards that definitely gets much better. I'm going to assume in the next set there's going to be more equipments, which then makes any cards that, you know, involve equipments much better. We got Embercleave, of course, because you wouldn't be playing an equipment deck without Embercleave, especially splash in red. In that sense, I wouldn't say it's a splash of red. It's kind of like a 50-50. It looks like we got more red than we do white. Or actually, looking at it, it's maybe a little bit mixture of both. Shadow Spear is actually very interesting here because, you know, if anyone's playing like Dream Crawlers, this actually gives rid of their hexproof and indestructible. So even if they have things that can, you know, get indestructible, you can actually essentially just remove their indestructible, which is very, very good. Spikefield Hazard, you know, and, you know, it's got some interesting things. You know, get the War Leader, which is essentially the Warrior Lord, which gives all our warriors +1/+1, which essentially I think most of our creatures, if not all our creatures, are warriors. Which aren't a lot of creatures actually looking about it, but yeah, it looks like just straight up warriors. I just want to make sure. And Elspeth Conqueror's X makes soldier tokens. I want to see if they're warrior tokens. I didn't know 100%. Outlaws Merriment is actually in here, which is a very interesting card that I don't feel like you see a lot of, but in this style of warrior deck, because, you know, essentially can make warrior tokens, though it does make warrior, cleric, and rogue tokens, which is kind of interesting. But overall, I mean, what it's trying to do is just be an aggressive equipment deck, play a bunch of warriors, make it hard for your opponent to deal with. But overall, it's pretty interesting there. Sideboard's filled with a bunch of different cards that you could bring in case you feel like you are coming against certain things. The Legion Angels are just here because, you know, you're not going to play all your copies in your main board. You're just going to search for them once you play the one Legion Angel. Additional Conqueror's Death, Ox, because, you know, it's one of those good cards if you want to be super aggressive and start, you know, discarding cards to then draw 3 new cards, or discard your hand to draw 3 new cards. Even in an empty hand, you know, drawing 3 cards for 5 mana is pretty solid, and getting a 4/2 out of it. You know, you can escape it for 2 and exile 8 extra cards. But I feel like you can always throw some things in the sideboard if you feel like certain cards just aren't working out. You can always fix the mana base if you don't think playing a bunch of modal lands are the way to go. Well, let me know what you guys think about the deck overall. At some point, like I do with most of these lists, I start playing the decks as like examples so you guys can get some gameplay previews of how the decks run before you go ahead and actually, you know, craft these decks in general. All right, so the next deck on the list is actually an Izzet Aggro deck. This one actually is kind of interesting compared to like the other Izzet decks that you kind of seen or seen on the channel, whereas this one's kind of playing very creature heavy and style, so it's like a more of a 50-50 split between creatures and instants and sorceries on what it's trying to do. You know, it's still got the 1 mana cards for the easy casting, you know, instant speed things, you know, to essentially make your storming entity cost cheaper, essentially getting out of the battlefield for 2 mana instead of 5. So essentially there's that, but we got things in here like we got like the Voldaren Arcanist, which is a 1/3 for 2 mana. We can tap it for colorless mana and spend it to actually cast an instant or sorcery spell, essentially helping us cast these instants or sorcery spells, which is good. I got Careless Celebrant as another 2/1 blocker, or 2/1 creature, and whenever it dies, you'll see damage to our creature or planeswalker opponent controls, so it's something your opponent doesn't want to block. because essentially it's going to fling the damage at your opponent's creature and or planeswalker. So it does create an interesting blocker, especially against more aggressive style decks. Fire Prophecy, so we just discard something to the bottom of our library, draw a new card, and deal 3 damage to target creature. We can discard 2 cards, draw 2 cards, or discard a card, draw 2 cards. That's sorcery speed, which is definitely very interesting. You know, I guess we're playing I don't, sometimes the import tool is a little weird when it imports like decks for some strange reason. I guess instead of putting 3 copies up from Zendikar Rise, and put 1 card from that one. We got Midnight Clock in here as like a good way to put counters on and make a mana producer. And also when we get to you know, the 12th hour, we can then essentially draw a bunch of cards. Vision's another appearance here because yet again it's an instant sorcery style deck, so it allows us to dig for those instant sorcery decks to make our deck that much stronger, looking for spot removal and or, you know, counter spell possibly that we run a couple of, but not a lot of. Fury to kind of fling something into our opponent's face. Wolverine, which is interesting here because this deck is playing a lot of things that, you know, benefit from having, you know, 3 or more instants or sorcery cards in our graveyard. So this actually makes it kind of interesting against like a rogue style matchup, because this essentially now has double strike as long as there's 3 or more cards. This card benefits from playing non-spells. Sure, it's a 3 mana 2/2, but eventually if you start playing more spells, this thing will definitely become much stronger and definitely get harder to deal with. Momentum Rumbler, same thing. Whenever it attacks, if it doesn't have first strike, put a first strike counter on it. Whenever it attacks and if it has first strike, it gets double strike, so essentially making these much tougher to deal with. Leyline Tyrant is actually a very interesting card here because essentially what I'm thinking in my head what this deck's trying to do. So if let's just say you don't have a play at the end of your turn, you have a couple mana open, it's red mana, you can just tap it, add it to your pool, because your pool doesn't end as phases end, so essentially you can just kind of carry mana over at the end of turns, kind of building this up over time. And if our opponent decides to remove this, if we start getting our, you know, this mana added up, this red mana, essentially whenever this card dies, that red mana then gets thrown at your opponent's face for that much damage to any target, whether it's a creature or to your opponent's face, which definitely makes this very interesting. Your opponents definitely want to get rid of this as soon as pretty much you put it into play. But once you start adding this mana, you can essentially float this mana until this was removed, so essentially being able to play some of your spells on other turns that you normally wouldn't because your mana wouldn't have been as high. But definitely an interesting card. I don't really know how good it's going to be, but definitely kind of cool in a sense. We got Experiment with the Overlord, which I think is very solid because as we kind of build instants and sorceries in our graveyard, it's definitely going to create a decent sized, you know, a decent sized weird elemental creature onto the battlefield based on how many of those cards are in our graveyard. And then we can also return an instant or sorcery card back from our graveyard, which essentially makes it much better. Terror of the Peaks, because why not? You know, if we play, you know, all these other creatures, Terror of the Peaks could start flinging some damage at things. Shark Typhoon, because we're playing instants and sorceries. Essentially, this could be a way to kind of create more creatures or more threats on the board. In a more aggressive matchup, we can always play for its 2 mana cost with the X and create, you know, the 1 token kind of thing. But I kind of think with the way the deck is, this is going to be more of the creature producer than the actual cycling producer. And of course, why not? It's a deck full of creatures, or splashing red. Why not play some Embercleaves, make a lot of our things just that much stronger? And then our mana base is pretty straightforward. We got, you know, it looks like 17 lands in the thing, and then we play a splash of modal lands throughout the deck to kind of fill up the gaps in there. Let alone, it's a very interesting deck because it's going more creature and instants and sorcery heavy, whereas usually the normal Izzet Aggro decks go a few creatures and then, you know, a majority of spells. This one looks like it's going more of the even, just so that I guess you draw a good amount of threats compared to, hopefully I draw, you know, 1 or 2 of my main cards and then draw a bunch of spells to then bump up those cards. Is kind of like has us being able to kind of, you know, have threats almost every turn, even if our opponents even spot removal and some of those threats off the board. So this last and final deck up on the list was actually a fairly interesting one because at my like core, I always like Naya style decks. Essentially what this deck looks like it's trying to do is just trying to ramp up into some really big things. It definitely plays a bunch of interesting cards in order to do so. We're playing Kahira as our companion just because we're playing elementals or, you know, beasts and things like that. So essentially we are allowed to play Kahira as our companion. So in the late game we can always get a Kahira on the board. But essentially what we're trying to do here, it is fairly aggressive on trying to really ramp really hard into various things. As you can kind of see here on the top end, we are running the Yardo for the cycling. And if we actually draw through a lot of our deck, because we're going to be able to thin out our deck a lot, because there's ways to ramp up mana wise, we can eventually hopefully get him out for the cycling cost. Worst case scenario, we play the 7 mana, he'll be out for this the 8/8 trample haster for 7 mana. We have the Turn Timber Symbiosis, which is a 7 mana spell that we can also play as a land. But essentially, this is going to be one of those things that if we cast a spell that costs 3 mana or less, from this we have to put 3 additional +1/+1 counters on it, put the rest on the bottom of the library in any order. We got the Odu's Inversion. We can just destroy all non-land permanents, which is definitely very good if your opponent's playing a lot of like enchantments. If we're getting against like Esper Troll or something like that, where they're trying to play a lot of things on the board, definitely a good card there, which definitely slows them down. Or we can just play it as a land and just to play it battlefield tapped. You got some Elfbest Conqueror's Death for some of that top end spot removal. Elder Gargoroth, which is definitely a very hard card unless they have a direct like spot removal spell. It's definitely hard to remove otherwise, because it's Vigilance, Reach, and Trample for a 6/6. Shadow the Sky to start wiping the board out, especially against the more aggressive style decks. You got the Yarshin, which is an interesting card here, because when it enters battlefield, we have to search our library for a basic forest and a basic plains card, reveal this card, split into our hands, search follow the library. And then the other thing too that's very interesting, as much as there's some pay life spells, I think it's kind of interesting to have the second part, which is you can sacrifice non-land permanents to cast spells or activate abilities. So pretty much this card prevents our opponent from sacrificing things to pay the cost of activate abilities or spells. Crap. I know like there's the one mana rogue. As long as you have 8 or more, your opponent has 8 or more lands, you can sacrifice that to draw a card. Village Rites is another one. You can't sacrifice a creature as additional cost. Your opponent can't fling things into your face by sacrificing a creature. So essentially, it's a good way to have a way to prevent our opponent from doing things like that. Other than that, we got a lot of ramp. You got things to remove things on the board. Maze Mind Tome to kind of dig a little bit deeper. We got this for the creature slash the land. Some Scorching Dragonfires for the spot removal. Rite of Life for the life gain. A little bit of card draw. We got the Speckled Hazard for the one spot removal in case we really want to get rid of one particular card in exile instead of going to the graveyard, or we can play for the red mana tapped. We got Ballad Ged Recovery, so if anything goes to our graveyard, we can always add it back to our hand and then essentially replay it once we have the right appropriate mana. You got the Cultivate, which allows us to kind of ramp up, search a library for 2 cards, put one on the battlefield tapped, and the other one into our hand. But overall, the deck is kind of interesting on what it's trying to do. It's trying to be very aggressive into rampant and also keep the board clear until we kind of get out what we want. Essentially slowing down the more aggressive aggro style decks. And then the deck here, of course, is playing just a bunch of things that are just more so focused on like the cheaper and aggro style decks. Like Glass Caskets are on the side where you can always bring in if you feel like you're playing against a lot of aggro decks. Cinderclasm, yet again, same thing. If you feel like playing a lot against a lot of small creatures, this is definitely a good card for 3 mana. You can essentially do 2 damage across the board at instant speed. Valakut Exploration, whenever land enters the battlefield, you may exile top card of your library. You may play the card as long as it remains exiled. Instead, if there are cards exiled with this, put into the owner's graveyard, then it does that much damage to each opponent. So essentially, we exile something. If we don't play it, it deals that much damage to our opponent in the face. Thrashing Brontodon for the enchantment removal. Quest and Beast, because yet again it's another thing, goes over small creatures. And the Crags play Baloth, which is pretty interesting here because it's one of those things that essentially is kind of like our anti-control style card, because it's hexproof, it has haste, and it can't be countered. So essentially it's like very strong against, thinking about it, it's probably really strong against rogues in a way, unless the rogues have Death Touch. But in the sense that it has hexproof and haste, it's definitely a good solid 6/6. Though I will say it doesn't have trample, which is kind of unfortunate, but definitely an interesting card. I would say there's some cards in here you definitely could add in if you feel like you're playing against a lot of aggressive style decks. Like I think Cinderclasm is actually very strong for what it is. You could always get rid of Scorching Dragonfires if you don't think that's quick enough. I think Cinderclasm is definitely a good 2-drop in there. There's a lot of small creatures that are like 1/1s or have 1 toughness. This is definitely a card that kind of removes them. Also, if you get to the 3 mana, you can always pay the additional 1 mana to kick it and actually deal 2 damage to everything, which definitely gets rid of a lot more things. But Glass Casket's also another solid card. But of course, the deck is also, like I said, running board removals. We have the Shatter the Sky, we have the Ondu's. But if you feel like the early game is not removing a lot of things, you can always throw things like that into the deck. With that being said, guys, that is the list. Let me know which one's your favorite of these lists, if there's anything that really intrigues you out of all these decks. I mean, these are decks that are proven to win games. I know, like I said, they are more tuned for best of 3, but you can probably tweak it with the sideboard cards for whatever matchups you feel like you're playing against. You can kind of, swap some cards out for that. If you guys like the video, hit that like button. Like I said, it definitely helps out the channel a lot. If you want to post more videos, hit the subscribe button. I will catch you in the next video.